Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the poetry session. Thanks for turning up. As Sunandaji had said, it takes effort, so I appreciate the effort. So you'll see that you are all still in attendee mode rather than panelist mode. This means that I can't see you, so feel free to lounge. So we're just going to get straight into this. We are discussing here the poem, The Olive Tree. The poem is by Sabine-Baring Gould. So the purpose of discussing this is just to give another perspective. There's a great quote that the Swami has used, and he talks about how philosophy, how about Vedanta philosophy, is not just contained within one book, Bhagavad-Gita, or one tradition, the Indian tradition. This word Vedanta means the principles that underlie life and living. And so they are found everywhere. He says they're whispered in the trees and the brooks, in English poetry. And so this is the purpose of going through this poem, to see how the same sort of ideas that we're covering in this ancient Indian epic, the Bhagavad-Gita, are also found in other places. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to throw them into the chat box. And as I go through, I'll peek at it and see if I can get to those questions. So let's start off just by reading the poem, and then we'll have a brief understanding of what the narrative is and look at the analysis. The Olive Tree by Sabine-Baring Gould. Said an ancient hermit bending, half in prayer upon his knee, "Oil I need for midnight watching, I desire an olive tree." Then he took a tender sapling, planted it before his cave, spread his trembling hands above it, as his benison he gave. But he thought the rain it needeth, that the root may drink and swell. God, I pray thee send thy showers. So a gentle shower fell. Lord, I ask for beams of summer, cherishing this little child. Then the dripping clouds divided, and the sun looked down and smiled. Send it frost to brace its tissues, O my God, the hermit cried. Then the plant was bright and hoary, but at evensong it died. Went the hermit to a brother sitting in his rocky cell. "Thou an olive tree possessest. How is this, my brother? Tell." "I have planted one and prayed, now for sunshine, now for rain. God hath granted each petition, yet my olive tree hath slain." Said the other, "I entrusted to its God my little tree. He who made knew what it needed better than a man like me. Laid I on him no conditions, fixed no ways and means, so I wonder not my olive thriveth, whilst thy olive tree did die." Okay, very simple narrative here. We've got two hermits, each with a singular goal. They need olive oil for their midnight prayers, for which they need an olive tree. What we also see are two different approaches to the same goal, and two wildly different outcomes. So one hermit planted a sapling and prayed and prayed and prayed and got everything he prayed for and lost the olive tree. The second hermit planted his sapling and then that was it, waited. And he had an olive tree that yielded abundant olives. So the question here is, what is it that we can learn? Is it possible to have more volume? Not from my end, only from yours, I'm afraid. Unless I talk a lot louder, but I don't want to start yelling. So the question here is, what can we learn? And how can we apply it in our daily life? The subject is not just for our interest. It's not just for our conceptual understanding. The purpose is so that we can implement it and integrate it into our daily life. So we need to look at the symbols, the meanings, and the broad themes. So let's start with the themes that we're going to be covering in this poem and then see how they apply. So we're going to start with this idea of obligation. So you recall Sunandaji has been talking about selfless action. One of the ways she described it was to bring that quote from Huxley. The end goal of education is to do what we ought to do when it needs to be done, whether we like it or not. This is referring to our obligations. So when we think about this word obligation, often it takes on a sort of heavy burden. Things that we have to do, as if they're externally imposed. This is not the right way to think about obligation necessarily. If we reframe it, we can think about obligations simply as those actions that are required for us to maintain the roles and the relationships that benefit us in life. So what does this mean? You're a citizen of this country. That's a role that you have. It's a relationship that you have. Because you are a citizen, there are certain obligations that you must perform in order to maintain it. What happens if you commit treason? If you give shelter and succour to the enemy, or you plot against the country itself? Treason carries a heavy penalty. Your rights as a citizen are taken away. You're a parent. It's a role. It's a relationship. If you don't fulfill the legal obligations as a parent, TPR, termination of parental rights. They take your child away. Not only that, but if you don't perform what you might call the psychological or moral obligations as a parent, you may still be the parent to that child, but you lose the relationship. If you're a child-in-law, you have certain obligations. If you're a leader of a company or a country or a social group, these are the roles and relationships that we are adopting and occupying in life in order to maintain those certain obligations. I'm a son. If I don't call my parents on the other side of the world every so often, if I don't express my gratitude, express my love, what happens? Well, no one takes the parents away from me, but if after 2 years I finally call, I thought I'd say hello, I forgot that I had a son. The relationship is not maintained. Second aspect of obligations, or the way that we can think about them, is that they are the actions required to achieve the goals that we want for our lives. I want to be the CEO of my own company. That means I need to perform certain obligations. I need to learn certain things about myself. What are my skills? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? I need to learn about the business environment into which I'm going. I need to study and pass the appropriate university degrees, perhaps. These are the things I must do to achieve that goal. I want a successful, harmonious marriage. What are the things I must do to achieve that? What are the things I must not do to achieve that? So they're not just externally imposed burden stuff we have to do. They relate to the well-being that we experience in daily life. They are investments into our own future. If we don't perform our obligations, not only do we lose the result, as we're talking about, but we become mentally agitated. We don't do what we know we ought to have done. I didn't call my parents again on my father's birthday. I missed it. That's fine. He's okay. He's detached. Inside, my conscience pricks at me because I didn't do what I know I ought to have done. Our obligations exist in all domains of experience. So you take an obvious one such as marriage. You have material obligations within that relationship to help provide. Physical obligations, emotional connection, intellectual obligations, moral obligations, and spiritual. And so when it comes to analyzing our obligations, we can look at all of these domains. I'm a boss, I'm a subordinate, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a son-in-law, I'm a mother, I'm a lawyer, etc. What are the material obligations, the physical, etc.? So our obligations are generally of two types: regular, ongoing. So it means they're relatively fixed, they're stable, they're baked into the cake. So you know, for example, that when you become a parent, there will be certain ongoing obligations for disciplining, for guiding, for seeding positive emotions. It's baked into that particular obligation or that particular role. Second type of obligations are those that aren't necessarily baked into the cake, but when they come up, it's obvious that it is yours to perform. So again, you marry somebody, you are the person's spouse, and they are off at work, or let's say they're off on the other side of the world for a conference for a month. And out of the blue, their brother turns up. Someone's got to show the guy around and take him out to dinner and find him a place to stay and so forth. Normally it would fall to your spouse, but because your spouse is overseas, it falls to you. Now, that kind of obligation isn't necessarily baked into the cake. You're not going to be doing that on a regular basis. But when it comes up, you know, okay, this is mine to do, so you do it. So this is what we mean by obligation. Those duties that are an investment into our future well-being. This means then that we all have obligations to perform because we are all occupying a particular role and we all are maintaining certain relationships. It means that they are defined by our own nature. The word that Sunandaji has been using is vasanas. And within a specific context or environment, according to your roles and goals. So you take the example of Arjuna on the battlefield in this righteous war. This is something that Krishna says to Arjuna. He says, further, looking at your own duty, you should not waver, for there is nothing better for a kshatriya than a righteous war. Kshatriya, if you remember, is the Sanskrit word which means warrior. So what's the context? What's the environment? It's a righteous war. Who is Arjuna within it? He's the leader of the army. What is his nature? What are his vasanas? He is a warrior nature. He has desires for fame, for glory, for valor. So what does this tell us? You've got someone who has a nature for fighting and for victory, whose role in life is the leader of an army, and he finds himself in the middle of a righteous war. There is nothing better for such a person to express their vasanas, to express their nature. And yet, what do we see with Arjuna? He collapses on the battlefield and says, I don't know my duty, because he's so confused, because he personalizes the situation. Take, for example, now this is not part of the Gita, but let's imagine that for some reason, Arjuna's mother somehow comes to the edge of the battlefield. Is it her obligation to fight? Same context, it's a righteous war, but it's not her obligation to pick up a weapon and fight. She has a different nature, a different role, and therefore her obligation is not to fight. So this means that we have to exercise that choice of action to introspect, understand who I am, where I am, what is my obligation. Why do we not perform our obligations? So this is the spot of the presentation where I would normally pause and ask you these questions, but since you can't speak, I'll just have to give you a moment to think about it. It's actually really an opportunity for me to have a drink. So why do we fault on our obligations? And what does it mean to fault on our obligations? So when we talk about faulting on our obligations, it means on the one hand that we don't do what we ought to do. That's an easy one, that's obvious. But there's another interesting aspect of faulting on our obligations, and that is to do too much. We either don't do enough or we go too far. The question is, what causes us to miss the mark? Why do we either not come forward far enough or do way too much is because we are functioning on our own personal demands, self-interest. We're not doing what we ought to do. Instead, we're doing what we want to do. I don't want to do this, or I want to do this and this and this and this. We push too far. There is this arrogant feeling of, I know exactly what needs to be done. And the reason we're calling it arrogant is because it's coming from the ego. The knowledge of what needs to be done is humble when it's coming from our obligations. We're taking our personal preferences out of it and simply saying, I know what my job is here. I'm a warrior in a righteous war. But when there is that arrogant feeling of I know, coming from the ego, coming from the mind, that's when our personal demands will be pushing forward. So how does this relate? Okay, we've understood some ideas about obligation and so forth, but what does it mean in terms of the poem that we've just read, and what does it mean in terms of our daily life? So let's look at some of the different elements of this poem. So this is how we can start to analyze. We've got a failed hermit and a successful hermit. These are the two protagonists. We've got an olive tree, which is the thing that they both want, and we've got the olive oil, which is the reason that they want it. And then we have the methods of approaching that goal. One, praise and praise and praise to God. Lowercase g is deliberate there. And the other simply plants and waits. So again, just to yourself, let's start to think about it. The failed hermit and the successful hermit. What do they refer to in daily life? This is a narrative. This is an imagined scenario, fictional. We need to find something out here in the real world that they relate to. Who is the failed hermit? Who is the successful hermit? We can broadly start to say that a failed hermit is an unwise person. So we're talking about wisdom. Well, in fact, this is the title of this year's presentation, Clarity and Wisdom. What is wisdom? It's something that we all want. It's something that we'd all like to think we are. What does it mean to be wise? Well, a wise person is someone who knows how to live well. Now, this of course opens up a whole new series of questions as to what it means to live well. But that can actually start to be answered in the next section or the next couple of bullet points. But let's just stay with that for the moment. A wise person is someone who knows how to live well, who knows what choices to make. Whereas an unwise person is someone who lacks the proper education of what living well actually is and how to achieve it. So then what does the olive tree represent in your life? You are a hermit. Maybe you're the wise one, maybe you're the unwise one, maybe you're a mixture. What does the olive tree represent for you? I desire an olive tree. Why does the person desire an olive tree? Why do we desire anything? What is the olive tree representing? And what's the thing we're trying to get out of the olive tree? The olive oil. So you can think of the olive tree as symbolizing worldly success. I'm a parent. There's some worldly success associated with that field of activity. I'm a business person. I'm a student. I'm a husband. I'm a mother. I'm a lawyer. Each of these roles has an end point, some sort of worldly success that we're trying to get. The olive tree. The olive tree itself is sought for yet another purpose, an end beyond the olive tree. The olive tree is sought not for the olive tree per se, but for the olive oil that it yields. You don't want worldly success for its own sake. Why do you want worldly success in your particular field of activity? for the sense of satisfaction that it brings. This is why we seek any particular object. So we have two methods by which we can try to achieve this worldly success and the satisfaction that comes from it. Praying to God. So this is why we're saying this is all metaphor and simile and analogy. Because the atheist might look at this poem and say, good, this is one I don't need to worry about because I don't believe in all that nonsense. I don't do any prayers to God. It applies. When we talk about praying to God, we can think about it as that attitude of demanding from the world. Take a very mundane example. You're driving in your car and you're going to the local shopping mall. Don't you say, oh, come on, get me a park right by the shop that I'm going to. I want one right outside. It's blazing hot. I don't want to walk. We put a demand on the world. Come on, open up. I want a good park. That attitude of give me. We are making a demand. Now, whether we get the parking space opened up or not is a separate matter. The point is, it's the attitude that we hold while we are performing the action, while I'm trying a case, while I'm disciplining a child, while I'm firing an employee or hiring an employee, while I'm doing anything. There's an attitude. One way is to pray, as it were, to ask, to demand, give me. And what's interesting is what this poem is saying is that if we demand long enough, we'll get the thing that we are demanding. If we put the right causes in, we'll get it. What you pursue, you eventually end up getting. This is one way of approaching the world, through our own demands and that arrogant notion of I know what I need, I know what I want, I know what is right and good for me. Give it. Second attitude of planting and waiting. What does the successful hermit do? He performs his obligation. Now, he doesn't just sit in his rocky cell and say, olive tree would be nice. No, he performs his obligation. You can't expect an olive tree without an olive sapling. So what does he do? He performs his obligation and then surrenders. He doesn't claim to know how to make an olive tree grow out of the ground. He does what he understands his obligations are and then surrenders the rest to the forces of nature. We do what we ought to do and then surrender the result. These are the two different attitudes. Demanding from the world based on what we want and what we think is correct, or assessing our obligations and then letting go of the result. Not craving for it. That's the poem. That's the idea of obligation. That's the symbols and their meanings. How do we put it into practice? How do we apply it? So let's look at two aspects, intellect and mind. These are the two parts of the inner personality. So the job of the intellect is to discriminate. It's to question. So this is what we do. Where am I? What is the field of activity in which I am functioning? It's my family life. It's with my son or daughter. It's my business. It's my social life. It's with my parents. It's my physical health. It's my spirituality. It's my finances. It's my career. It's on the battlefield. Name the field of activity that you're in. Understand that clearly first. Then who am I here? Okay, and your business. In one meeting, you're at the top of the food chain. The next meeting, an hour later, you're at the bottom of the food chain. Middle manager, speaking to her subordinates. Then she goes to the next meeting where her superiors are speaking to her. Who am I here? I've been taking these Vedanta classes for years. I'm a Vedanta teacher. When I go to the Vedanta Academy, that role gets turned on its head. I'm the Vedanta student. In fact, I'm always the Vedanta student, but you understand this distinction. We have to understand what our role is. Another good example, Thanksgiving dinner. This year you go to your parents' place. There you are the son or the daughter. Next year you go to your parents-in-law place. You're the son or daughter-in-law. Now, if you're married and you've had this experience, you will know. It's a very different environment. You're the same person, but the things you can get away with in one environment are not the same things that you can get away with in the other environment. The things you have to do, the things you must not do, they can be wildly different because you're in a different role. What am I trying to achieve here? So goals and ideals are effects. They belong in the future. If we don't know where we're trying to go, it doesn't matter which direction we move. If we don't have a clear idea of what our goals are, then how can we begin to understand what our obligations are, what our causes are? So once we've understood where we are, who we are, what we're trying to achieve, you continue to reflect, what are my obligations and what are the limits of those obligations? Put this down on a piece of paper. Answer these questions systematically. Go within and try to find them out. Seek the guidance of someone else who perhaps might have a good perspective on your situation. Physical, material, physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. What am I trying to achieve? How do I get there? This is the job of the intellect. What's the job of the mind? The job of the mind is to surrender. The opposite of surrender is this feeling of, I know I want. It's that constant pushing of demands out into the world. Rather is to accept, for the mind to accept certain things and yield and stop demanding in this way. The question is, how do you get there? This again is in fact led by the intellect. We need to understand that we can't make anything happen. If you're a golfer, you know this. If you've ever tried to if you've ever tried to hammer a nail into a piece of wood and struck your thumb, you know this. You have a choice of action, but not outcome. And this is something that we often confuse. We cannot choose the outcome, but we can choose the action. When we get frustrated that our action has not resulted in what we want, it's because we've had this connection to the outcome. Snap the connection to the outcome and connect instead just to the action. When we recognize that when I strike that ball, a gust of wind, a freak bird, something can happen to knock it off course. There's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is address the ball, swing, swing. That's all I can do. The rest is left up to who knows what. The universe will continue to unfold as it will. We have this powerful choice of action, but it's only within the domain of ourself. There's very little we can do to effect an immediate change in the universe at large. It will continue to unfold according to the momentum that it has acquired for as long as you care to project backwards. It's rolling onwards. There are multiple causes completely unknown to us, in effect right now, to change the course of human history. We keep hearing this phrase, who could have thought 12 months ago that we'd all be in this situation with COVID-19? In fact, lots of people thought it. There are reports that thick outlining exactly what would happen if a pandemic hit. But nonetheless, this is what we will become aware of. Our lives can change overnight without us being aware of it, without us being prepared for it. Surrender. You can do so much, but not so more. You can do only so much. We have a limitation to our action. Be content with the obligations that you have, and then let the universe roll forward and see what happens. Roll the dice and see where it lands. It's not exactly a dice roll because you have assessed cause and effect relationships, but there is an unknown component to it, and we must surrender to that uncertainty. If we don't surrender to the uncertainty, we will suffer. And you put this into practice in all of the different domains of your experience. Your health and your physical well-being. Who am I? Well, I'm the owner of this body. What's the context? My physical health now and for the rest of my life. What are my obligations? What must I do? What must I not do? What am I trying to achieve? I want to live to 114 and be fully cognizant the whole time until I pop off at the end. That's my goal, etc. Social life, parenting, study, work, career, spirituality, etc. There are a whole host of fields of activity that we're engaging in where we can put this into practice. So let's pick one. It's not the olive tree anymore, it's the parenting tree. And so we can start to look at the symbols that we have in the poem and think about what they might represent in this particular field of activity. And again, this might be somewhere that we could stop and chat, but since we're not doing that, start to think for yourself. And there are multiple right answers that we can put on the right-hand side, according to your own knowledge and experience, different types of relationships, different types of circumstances. So let's just go through some, and we'll just put some placeholders in just to give an idea of what the analysis is like. So we started off by looking at the failed hermit and the successful hermit. So the failed hermit, or in this case, the failed parent, if you want to put it that way, could be something like a helicopter parent. What is a helicopter parent? You're probably familiar with the term. It's the sort of parenting that micromanages everything. Doesn't give the child freedom to learn, to move, to make mistakes, to fall over and then try and get back up again. Everything is micromanaged. Every behavior is observed. The child never gets an opportunity to really exercise her moral compass, her moral muscle, because she's just doing what she knows parents want her to do. Helicopter parenting. Bulldozer parenting is another one that you may be familiar with. So these are different types of parenting styles that have been shown to be unsuccessful. And this is not just me talking. Look at the research. There are plenty of people who are subject matter experts who are talking about these sorts of phenomena. Find out. Whereas the successful parent is objective. They have that capacity to stand back, do what needs to be done, and also understand where they should be hands off. So the olive tree and the olive oil. So the olive tree, we were referring to that worldly success in that particular field of activity. So as a parent, what's the thing that you're trying to achieve? What's the olive tree in this regard? And why? What's the olive oil that you're trying to get out of it? Well, as a parent, you could argue one of the things you're trying to do primarily is to make yourself redundant, is to make your child a happy, well-adjusted, mature human being so that they don't need you anymore. This is one way of describing it. Why? Satisfaction. That olive oil is always going to be the same. The reason we do anything, the reason we want any kind of worldly success is because we want that sense of peace, that sense of well-being or satisfaction from it. So what does the failed hermit do? Prays to God. So what does this mean? does do what he ought to do, but then does way too much because he thinks, I know what's required here, and then functions according to his own demands. Whereas the successful hermit does what he ought to do and then stands back. So what could this be with regards to the parent-child relationship? And again, there are multiple correct answers here, but as a placeholder, let's just use this word nagging. So you can think about it in this way. Your child is acting in a way which is not in their best interests. Perhaps they're not fulfilling their own obligations when it comes to schoolwork. They have developed some relationships with other students that are clearly detrimental. They have engaged in some activities that are distracting and not necessarily taking them down the right path. And so you can see the child doing something that perhaps she ought not to do. What's the goal that you're trying to achieve? You want them to understand. You want their education, social, cultural, moral. You want them to see what ought to be seen, the truth. That's the olive tree. That's the worldly success. You want them to be well adjusted in that particular field. And so you might bring the subject up. I see you being hanging out with so-and-so. You know, both his parents smoke. I've seen him smoking. You know, I know what goes on at the teacher meetings. I know what they talk about. Do you think that's the kind of person you should be hanging out with? This guy's smoking cannabis or whatever. And then you nag. The child gives you some sort of, oh, but he's a good person, really. He's misunderstood. He's under so much stress at home. It's no wonder he's smoking pot, etc. There's some pushback. What does the parent do? Everything the child says, there's another response. Yes, but. Because I'm the parent. You know how smart I am? I've been through these arguments with my mother 20 times. I've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 14 years about what I'm going to say to you when this comes up. So I know, I'm ready. And you're right. Everything you say is factually accurate and it's actually pointing in the right direction. It's irrelevant. Facts do not matter to the mind. Facts matter to the intellect. But when you approach the child with this demanding attitude, you're pushing your demands onto the child. Think back to when you've been the recipient of that, either from a parent, from a spouse, from a boss, from a friend. How did you react? Even though they were speaking truth, you harden up. You put a nice force field around you where logic and reason cannot enter. You block them off, you tune them out. Use your own sort of analogy here. This is happening. And the more the child blocks me, the more I push. The more I push, the more she blocks. What am I trying to achieve? A well-adjusted child. What am I actually achieving? Someone who won't listen to me and who's so aggravated that she will do the exact opposite of what I want. My olive tree hath slain. Why? Because I demanded. I pushed too far. What might the successful, objective parent do? Perform your obligation. You can't simply sit back and say, yeah, my child's hanging out with kids who are smoking pot. Who am I to say what is right? Who am I to say what is right? You are the parent. You are the one who says what is right. You have knowledge the child lacks. You know her brain won't stop developing for another 11 years. You know what happens when you start smoking pot too early, etc. You know it's your obligation to guide, to put boundaries in. So you don't just sit back and do nothing. You plant an olive sapling. You plant a seed. So again, this is determined by the specific circumstances. Who really knows what is the perfect way to function here? But you could say, knowing your child's nature, knowing the sort of relationship that you have, maybe you can just be the intellect that you wish she had. Ask the question, that you would like her intellect to ask herself? Do you think you are going to be influenced in a negative way by hanging out with these guys who are smoking pot? And then you're going to get a response, and it will probably be, no, I'm fine. Maybe you might decide to respond once. Are you sure? Because I've seen you get influenced by your friend Jane. She started listening to that music and you started. And then when she left town, you stopped. That's enough. Whatever response you get, simply accept it. You're not there to play intellectual ping pong. You are there to plant a seed and then let it grow within her nature. Have some faith, have some trust. She's an intelligent human being. You have been in her life for 14 years. You have lived those values. You have surrounded her with those values. You're a good person. Have some faith that when you plant that seed, if you don't force it, it will perhaps grow. Know what you ought to do it, and then don't push too far, otherwise you ruin the whole thing. The parenting tree. By your name here. This is how we can start to integrate these poems. Understand the symbols, the meaning, and the practical application. It's not just enjoying the poem and enjoying the intellectual game of juggling ideas. If it doesn't get practiced in daily life, then it's just another subject. We're looking for transformation, not just information. The spiritual tree. Okay, we're not going to go through this. It'll be too much. But you can understand what we're doing now. What is a failed hermit, a successful hermit? What's the olive tree, the olive oil? What is praying to God? What is planting and waiting? In your spiritual life, what do these things mean? Start to fill in the bullet points. And as you do that, you'll start to get a clear idea of where your obligation starts and finishes. You get that clarity. And when you take your own personal preferences out of it, when you take your own arrogant sense of I know out of it, that is that surrender. Then you act appropriately without ego. You just perform your obligations. And as Sunandaji was saying, when you act in this way, sacrificially, without your own ego polluting it, you gain wisdom. Clarity and wisdom is what we're searching for. This knowledge of Vedanta explains what it is and how to get there. Whether we're getting it from the Bhagavad-Gita, which is a very direct source, or whether we're getting it from the olive tree, or any one of these other magical sources. The problem is that we need a well-developed intellect to be able to tease it out from these other sources. Luckily, we are blessed that there are others who've gone before us who have done a lot of that work for us. Turned what is sometimes abstruse, albeit beautiful texts, into something that we can actually digest and get nourishment from. All right, that's the end of the presentation. Normally I pick up questions here. So if you have any questions you'd like to throw into the text box, by all means, throw it in. I'll wait for a few moments. If not, that's the end of today's session, or the current session. We are back again at 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time for Sunandaji's third discourse and Q&A. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you. The question now is, what do I do about it? Because the circumstances have changed. So what do you do? I am happy to be in the position where I can say, I don't know, because it's specifically dependent upon who the child is, their specific nature, what their relationship with you is like. Is that relationship generally pretty open and pretty harmonious? Is the relationship very tense and fraught with conflict in general? Is the child highly emotional? Is the child really intelligent? Are they of moderate intelligence? Are they 14 or 16? Big difference in those 2 years. How do you relate to it? What choices do you make? Only you can answer that question. But it's the same basic process of trying to figure out what your obligations are based upon what you're trying to achieve. And so planting the seed, as you point out, may now start to become more like an intervention. Okay, you take a much more extreme example. The friend of yours is about to get into a car after a night of heavy drinking. I remember that Vedanta talk, just plant the seed. Don't you think you've had too much to drive? And then step back. No. Tackle that guy to the ground and wrestle the keys off him. That's what a friend would do. When he's cursing you and trying to strike you and grab the keys back, that's what you do with love for your friend. So at some point, you have to recognize when the obligation does become something like that kind of intervention. So there are times when it does become that. Of course, you want to avoid the conflict and antagonism because it is resisted, but there'll be times when that is unavoidable. Perfect example, Bhagavad-Gita. They tried all reasonable ways and means of defusing, de-escalating, and solving that war, that conflict. Mediation didn't work. Compromise didn't work. The only thing left to them was to go into battle. And so they had to. In fact, it's beautifully constructed. The Mahabharata is beautifully constructed in that way. It makes it absolutely clear. There's not really any room for equivocation or grey areas. Well, maybe they shouldn't have gone into the war. Maybe Arjun is right. No. When you understand the backstory, you know they're doing the right thing by fighting the righteous war. Uproot your child from that environment forcibly. Use the force of law that you have at your disposal. That might be the right thing to do sometimes. You might not be a very popular human being for a while, but that's not your job. That's not your goal. If your goal is to be liked and to be seen as a cool parent or a fun parent or a nice parent, then that maybe is the wrong goal to be achieving. So you need to decide. And as we often say, take the advice of others. When we are in these very difficult circumstances, like the one that we've talked about, a child who is going down the wrong path, you will be mentally upset. You will be agitated, unless you are, like Krishna. And so it will be much more difficult to see. So seeking the guidance of those people whose intellect you respect and whom you know don't have any skin in the game. Speak to them, get their advice. People who are educated in the subject matter. Speak to a child psychologist. Speak to someone who has had experience with this kind of thing. Not just your friend who seems to be living a good life. Yeah, she's living a good life because she doesn't have kids. She's much more stress-free. Don't ask her. Don't ask the person who has a terrible relationship with their own parents as an adult. She's going to give you wrong advice as well. You've got to pick the right person. And then pray for luck. No, don't pray for luck. I didn't say that. I'm going to cut that out of the recording. All right, thanks guys. I appreciate your time and attendance on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. we will conclude here, and I'll see you back at 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Hare Om.